afternoon, and thanks for joining today's Port of Los Angeles media briefing. I'm Chelsea Boyd from the Port's communications team, filling in today for Philip Sanfield. And joining us this month from Washington, D.C., is our Executive Director, Jean Seroka. Hello, Jean.
Great to see you, Chelsea, and welcome, everyone. Yes, I'm currently in our nation's capital for meetings centered around port funding and other projects. Today, we're fortunate to return to Celebro Studios with its breathtaking view. You can see the White House right across the street and the iconic Washington Monument off in the distance. We're very excited for today's upcoming guest, Jared Bernstein, chair of the United States Council of Economic Advisors, appointed by President Biden and confirmed by the United States Senate. Jared is entrusted with providing economic advice to the president in order to help formulate domestic and international policy. We'll discuss a range of economic topics, including the profound influence of ports and supply chains on the U.S. economy. I'm really looking forward to this conversation and then opening it up to your questions.
Same here, Jean. First, though, let's start as we always do with a brief overview of our May and year-to-date cargo numbers.
Absolutely, Chelsea. The Port of Los Angeles moved 753,000 20-foot equivalent units in May, continuing our trend of strong, consistent volumes since the beginning of the year. While we're down about 3% compared to last May, we're right in line with projections and overall off to a solid start in 2024. On the import side of our ledger, we landed at about 390,000 TEUs, which is 5% shy of last year's very strong May. Looking at the key data, including an impressive May employment report that was well beyond expectations, it points toward continued consumer spending. In fact, the National Retail Federation said just that imports into the U.S. will reach their highest level in 2 years during the upcoming summer months. Great news continues on the export front, with container counts coming in at 126,000 TEUs. That's a 24% jump compared to last year. Los Angeles has also hit a new milestone, 12 consecutive months of year-on-year export gains. And during that period, the port has exported more than 1.5 million TEUs, which is almost a third more than the previous 12 months. Remarkable increase over such a sustained period of time. Even though we're finally seeing a promising rebound, there's still ample room for growth on the export side of our business. To address this, we're actively engaged with agricultural interests, manufacturers, service providers, and top U.S. officials to make an even bigger dent in the trade imbalance. Now, shifting over to empties, we moved 236,000 TEUs in May. It's about 12% off last year at this time, but it's on average with what we've been shipping back to Asia thus far in 2024. The big picture in total, after 5 months, we're off to a really good start. The Port of Los Angeles has successfully handled 3.9 million TEUs, which is an impressive 18% increase over 2023. As we gear up for the second half of the year, I expect our strong performance will continue. Last year, we peaked in June with more than 830,000 TEUs, and while I don't anticipate quite reaching that mark, our forecast for this month indicates consistent volume across our docks, somewhere in the mid to upper 700,000 TEU range. And finally, this Sunday, I'll be traveling to Taiwan and China to participate in discussions on increasing cargo and the role our industry plays in reducing our carbon footprint. Along with a few port colleagues, we'll meet with shipping lines and terminal operators to help continue the optimization on our docks, and we'll engage with customers to explore all possibilities of bringing even more cargo through the Los Angeles port. Then, in collaboration with the Port of Long Beach, we'll co-sponsor a China-U.S. Green Shipping Corridor Symposium in Shanghai. We'll strategize with our port counterparts and other stakeholders as we work towards establishing a trans-Pacific trade route that uses low and zero carbon vessel fuels. More cargo, more jobs, and decarbonizing global trade. It's our objective now and into the future.
Thank you, Gene, for that concise summary. Would you please introduce our special guest?
Oh, it's my pleasure, Chelsea. Before his current position as chair of the three-person Council of Economic Advisors, which directly reports to the president, Jared Bernstein served as chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Biden from 2009 through 2011. With a distinguished career spanning the last 3 decades, Jared has excelled as an economist, educator, commentator, and author of multiple acclaimed books. Jared, it's great to have you with us today. And hopefully it wasn't too long of a commute from the Eisenhower office building.
No, it was great to get outside and have a bit of a walk.
That's great. Start off with a picture of what you're doing. You get a call from the Oval Office. You're asked to come visit the president, talk about the economy. What is that like? How do you prepare? And what are those conversations that you have to prepare our president for the downline economic look of the nation?
Well, as you've mentioned in the introduction, I've had the privilege of working with now President Biden when he was the vice president. And so we have a long rapport on talking about the economy. And I always describe myself as having a PhD in Bidenomics, by which I mean I understand what the president is looking for when he's talking about the economy. It's pretty simple. If GDP is up, the middle class is falling behind, something is very wrong. And he believes it's the role of government to create the connective tissue, the policy architecture to reconnect any kind of a disconnection in that spirit. If I run into the Oval and say, Mr. President, the stock market is up 14% today, he's like, good to know. How's it affecting middle-class families? How's it affecting union families? How's it affecting families like the one he grew up in Scranton? And so he has he's always maintained, it's kind of unusual for someone who's been in politics over his long career, a real tangible sense of what the economy, how the economy is really working for working people or not.
This administration arguably has done more for the supply chain than any other in recent memory. And I know that firsthand. What have you guys in the administration learned from working with private sector interest in transportation, ports on the government side across the country, and how all this work in the supply chain weaves into the American economy?
Well, I could take the rest of the program to answer that question, which is by way of saying we've learned a ton. By the way, we learned a lot from listening to you, so that's in the mix as well. I would say the first thing we learned is do not ignore your supply side. Don't forget about your supply chains. Don't assume that your supply chains are just in the background running seamlessly, that they're appropriately resilient or impenetrable to shocks. They're not. We know that. Secondly, I think we've learned some really important lessons about working together with a wide range of private sector actors who have equities in this space. A great example, which is very timely, is the Port of Baltimore is fully reopened as of today. Okay, so the bridge isn't back yet. That's going to take longer to build. But the work that it took to get that port quickly, relatively quickly, back up and running involved constant interaction between the White House, the relevant unions, the local and the state government, the mayor, the governor, the sectors that were all there on the ground. We did the same thing a few months ago when a bridge collapsed on part of I-95. It was expected to take 6 weeks to get it back up and running. I think it was up and running in a couple of weeks. And the reason that occurred is because of this recognition that we have to work together. Now, look, the other thing we've learned is that action, that working together, that kind of teamwork approach to this, very broad, doesn't happen when you snap your fingers, and it isn't something that you can kind of start up the morning of the crisis. You have to have ongoing task force who are designated to work on specifically that. So when the president got here in 2021, consultation with his economic team, he quickly realized that we needed something called a supply side disruption task force. Yes. Okay, card-carrying member. Right. Stood it up quickly, got to work, working with folks like you, with the unions, with the with the management, with all the relevant teams, particularly in LA and Long Beach, because we know about the maritime parking lot out there. That task force has now morphed into, at least under this president, a permanent supply side resilience committee. Again, I am proud to be a member. That's going to make sure that when these supply side shocks occur, we don't have to ramp up from zero. We're ready to get on the phone with our relevant secretaries. Obviously, Secretary Buttigieg has been critical in the ports case, and members of the cabinet are all chipping in. So I think those are some of the lessons. Oh, I'm sorry. Again, I told you I could go on for too long about this. You and I were talking before we went on. If you had come up to me in 2019 and said, Jared, the two words that are going to mean a lot to you over the next couple of years are dwell time, I would not have known what you were talking about. This audience knows what dwell time is, how long a container sits in a port. Dwell time, when spiked up, we knew we had to get dwell time back down. You know, it's a good example of a good granular example of the work that we found ourselves into.
Yeah, on that note, Jared, in the Port of Los Angeles, we look at this dashboard of numbers every morning. In 30 seconds, I get a snapshot of the health of our port. Those dwell times are at or better than where they were before the COVID-19 surge of import cargo.
Yeah, so let me say something about that. You know, one of the things, we got a good inflation report this morning. Month of May, inflation was flat. Great to see. Zero over the month, 3.3% over the year, which is down a little bit more than 60% from its peak in mid-June, when we were really having all kinds of dwell time headaches.
Right.
If you look at the core goods component and you plot that against the kind of measures you were just talking about, plot that against any of these measures of supply chain resiliency or supply chain health, you'll say they move very closely together. So it doesn't surprise me what you're telling me about dwell times when I consider the fact that over the past year, I looked at this number before we got on set, core goods inflation is actually down. I don't mean that it's growing more slowly. It's down. It's got a negative. It's down 1.7%. That connects directly to supply side normalization.
So well put. Just last Thursday, you gave a speech at the U.S.-China Symposium. I think it was the 21st annual meeting. And you talked about the shifting trade winds, sourcing, manufacturing, nearshoring, and a whole plethora of information. Could you capsulize the messaging that you got across just last week?
Yeah, let me start doing that from the perspective of the kinds of things you were talking about in your introduction and the work that I know you've been doing so avidly for a long time now. One of the points that I underscored in that and other speeches about our trade policy is, one, this is a really interesting time to be doing trade policy, so I'm glad you asked me the question. There are changes happening in real time, really stemming from the Biden-Harris worker-centered trade policy. That is, I've been in this town doing trade policy for a long time, and for decades, it's basically been, if it looks like it's going to lead to lower prices, then we're for it, without nearly enough regard for its impact on workers. Now, look, American households are consumers. We know that. We care a ton about that, especially in a climate where prices are still too high. We have an aggressive cost-cutting agenda to address the challenges that folks face in that space. But they're not just consumers. They're also workers. And when you lose an anchoring factory in a community that then experiences decades of disinvestment because of poorly thought through trade policy, that's not okay with this president. So one of the things we talked about in that speech is a both and trade policy, meaning that we both care a lot about workers and worker-centered trade and the impact of trade flows on their lives, on their communities. But we also care a lot about making sure we have a robust supply side and that trade flows are ample, robust, and that your ports remain busy with exports and imports. And yes, we'd like to see the trade balance come down, so exports over imports in that regard. And so what that means, and I think this has gotten somewhat confused in the trade discussion, is that this is not a matter of reducing trade flows. This is a matter of reducing trade flows with unfair trading partners. This is a matter of reducing trade flows when they threaten to undermine with overcapacity and underpricing key sectors that we're trying to support, particularly in electric vehicles, battery, clean energy production, critical minerals, things like that. But making sure those flows remain robust enough to help our supply side remain strong.
That's fantastic. As you well know, 1 in 9 jobs in Southern California, 1 in 52 across the nation emanate from the work the port does. And it's widely discussed with relation to the Port of Los Angeles that we move a lot of retail goods, a lot of finished products that are going to our stores that we're buying online. Today, we ship more parts and components for American factories through our port than we do finished goods. So on that note, if you look out the next couple of months, the next year, what does this economy look like for the average American? What is Wall Street going to see in this economy down the line?
Well, first of all, the average American is not Wall Street. There's Wall Street and there's Main Street. So we have to think about both. Secondly, starting where your question began, I think that we need to focus on a point you just made, probably a bit more than I don't mean we as an administration, I mean people who think about these dynamics. I know our administration this a lot. A lot of what's coming in our imports are intermediate, right? A lot of what's going out are meaning they are inputs into the production process. They're not finished goods. And those are important. I remember back when the Trump administration put a tariff on aluminum. One of the first companies that came and asked for an exemption from that tariff was Alcoa. Alcoa is the largest American aluminum company, and that was because they're obviously getting inputs that they need to streamline their production. So I think that when we're thinking about trade flows and why we still support robust, fair trade flows, worker-centered trade flows that support the many jobs you just described, we should be mindful of these inputs. But when you ask the broader question about the economy, look, we are still, I think imports are probably 15% of our GDP. Exports are probably 12%, the difference being trade deficit. So we still have a 70% consumer spending economy. And that gets to your other question. How's Main Street doing? And frankly, Wall Street has its bips and bops. I don't pay too much attention to the everyday ups and downs, but they are the tail on the dog. So if Main Street's doing well, Wall Street should follow. And the reason we've had a solid record on the economics of Main Street, working families, is because the job market has just been so strong for so long. I think you mentioned in your introduction. Let me cite a number today that I've been thinking about that I think is probably, this may be me because of the stuff I carry around in my head, but I just thought this was very impressive. So month of May, 272,000 jobs, okay? A couple of weeks ago, we got our jobs report for May. Big upside surprise. Great number. The president was happy. I briefed him, like you said, I briefed him on these numbers. He liked that number. Same month, May, 0 inflation. So look, no victory laps. We are far from out of the woods. We have more work to do. Prices are still too high. But that is a great microcosm of what we're trying to do. Maintain the strength of the job market while putting downward pressure on prices. And I think those indicators are healthy for Main Street.
And wages are keeping up better than some observers had expected, but that was part of the plan too.
Well, thank you. Now you're really playing into my hand here because today the CEA, so I chair the Council of Economic Advisors, we posted a blog on this, which I commend to everyone who can hear my voice. And it was on exactly this topic. It was called something like, you're of a similar generation to me, so you might remember the song Both Sides Now by, very pretty song. I won't start singing it, but I could. That was a song that told you to, look at both sides. When it comes to the economics you're asking about, got to look at both sides of the ledger. Inflation, yes. And again, prices are too high. We're doing everything we can to lower them. We're having some success. You also have to look at wages and incomes. So over the past year, inflation is up 3.3%. Wages are up 4.2% for middle wage workers. Okay, so the difference is real wage gains. We have 15 months in a row where year-over-year wages have outpaced prices, middle wage workers. It's really important. That's where we see a better purchasing power of the paycheck.
And unemployment has been down generationally 28 straight months now, I believe, below 4%.
Unemployment's been 4% or lower for, I believe, 28 months.
Yeah. Amazing. Good thoughts and all lined up with what we talk about on a regular basis. Chelsea, I know we've got some questions in the queue and some of the media folks on the line. I'll turn it back to you to hit that segment.
Thanks so much, Jean. So you're right, a few questions have come in advance. I just want to remind any media watching right now that if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into our Q&A box below. And when you do, remember to include your name and your affiliation. I'll grab a couple of these questions that have come in advance. Jean, the first one is for you, and it's from Lorianne LaRocco from CNBC. Lorianne asks, the International Longshoremen's Association that represents East Coast dock workers suspended talks with management this week. Are you receiving inquiries, or do you expect to, about diverting cargo to the West Coast and your ability to handle it?
No real knee-jerk reaction, Lorianne. Good to have you with us again this month. But as I've mentioned previously, going back to my travels in Asia 3 times so far this year, and I was in Europe just last month, folks on the import and export side have told me that they've shifted fractional amounts of their allocation to come over Los Angeles as a hedge, whether it be the security concerns in the Red Sea, the limited loadability restrictions due to draft in Panama, and the ongoing negotiations between the ILA and the USMX. Nothing huge, no big surge. But what we are seeing is that intact ocean box, the intermodal container that moves from Asia through to about 14 major hubs of distribution in the United States, coming back strong. So that's one of the micro trends that we're watching, but nothing since this announcement. And during these negotiations, there are stops and starts to kind of gather thoughts, to make sure follow-up is done. I don't see this as terribly unusual. Thanks for the question, Lori.
So, Mr. Bernstein, the next question comes to you, and it's in the same vein, but just a little bit different of a perspective. Laura Curtis from Bloomberg asks, East Coast dock workers have until September 30th to reach a deal with their employers, or we could see a coast-wide strike just before the election and the holiday season. Is the Biden administration prepared to get involved to prevent that?
Well, thank you for the question. It's certainly something that we watch carefully because of its potential impact on the economy. But it is the policy of our administration to encourage collective bargaining because we know it works. The president knows it works. This is the first president to actually walk a picket line. He always supports collective bargaining, but he also supports giving the parties the space they need when they're at this stage of negotiation. And we've consistently made a point of staying out of their way. We encourage them to negotiate in good faith. And I would refer you to the parties themselves for any updates on their negotiations at this juncture.
Thank you, Mr. Bernstein. The next question is also for you, and it comes from Bill Mongaluzzo of S&P Global. Bill asks for you to please explain the difference between President Biden's targeted tariffs on U.S. imports from China and the Trump campaign's proposal for across-the-board tariffs on imports from China, and the impact that each policy could have on cargo volumes in the U.S.
Another great question, and I would say that the short answer to your question about the difference between President Biden's approach and that of the former president is the difference between targeted and sweeping. The proposals that we've made are extremely targeted and would impact about 4% of Chinese imports. The proposal we've heard from the former president would impact not just all exports from China at a 60% tariff, but all imports from everywhere at a 10% tariff. That is an extremely sweeping policy. As I've mentioned, ours 4%, theirs 100%. Now, if you look at our tariffs in detail, you'll see that, and I'm talking about the updates to the 301s, which I think is what you're asking about, recently announced. You'll see that not only are they targeted, but they're targeted in areas where actually, at this point, we tend to export very little. If you look at Chinese electric vehicles, in 2023, we imported less than 400 million with an M Chinese electric vehicles. And we are clearly investing seriously both in public with private with private capital supported by public subsidies through the Inflation Reduction Act in building up a domestic EV sector here, EV battery sector here, chip sector as well. And so we need to protect those investments, and that's where that proposed tariff comes from. There's recently a paper that I would refer you to on this question of the sweeping nature of the proposed Trump tariffs. It comes out of the Peterson Institute, where they do very high-level academic work. It finds that if you combine the impact of the proposed Trump tax policies with the Trump tariffs, you end up with the middle class ending up behind by $1,700. That is, the tariffs end up being contributing to a $1,700 loss of income for the median household, and that of course is a very different kind of policy than anything we would support.
Thank you for that. Jean, the next question is for you, and I just want to remind everybody there is still time if you would like to ask a question here. The Q&A box is open. Jean, this question is from Greg Miller, and Greg asks, given that Asia West Coast ports spot rates have surged, why do you think May imports to the Port of Los Angeles are down both year on year and month on month? The Port of Long Beach has not reported May numbers yet, but third-party customs data implies that Long Beach is up in May versus April.
Hi, Greg. Good to hear from you again. Couple things go into this. One, at this time last year, there were some rumblings that the negotiations between our ILW dock workers and their employers association, the PMA, weren't going so well. We saw a little bit of a rush of cargo come in before what some people thought could be a breaking point. As I referenced, both May and June of last year were our highest months of volume. Then we started to see an uptick in August after the tentative agreement was reached between the two. Remember, those negotiations went on for about 13 months. A lot of people opined on what was happening, and we wound up having only a few bad days because of a little bit of back and forth between both sides, which ultimately got the deal done. On the notion of the spot rates, that still represents a very small percentage of the Trans-Pacific import market. Most importers here in the U.S. in that trade contract annually, some even multi-year. Those rates are in place. Now, there is a question based on strength of market. How far beyond the minimum quantity commitment can importers go before they shift into another rate genre? That hasn't been seen yet, but something we also watch. Cargo's down a little bit only because we had super big numbers a year ago. Continuing on, year-to-date 5 months, we're up 18%. And what I'm not seeing right now are canceled sailings coming from Asia in the weeks and months ahead. I'm also not seeing a weakening of purchase orders from both the manufacturing or retail sectors. And remember, those purchase orders, Greg, go in about 90 to 120 days before that vessel leaves Asia coming to Los Angeles. So all in all, not bad. Trends aren't 1 month at a time. We'll watch this as we continue throughout the balance of the year. Thanks for the question, Greg.
All right, thanks, Jean. We had a question come in from Mr. Bernstein. This comes from Katie Labosco with CNN. Katie asks, what are the reasons for keeping the Section 301 tariffs on Chinese-made consumer goods like shoes and luggage? Trade industry groups say these duties have increased prices for consumers.
Well, I think if you look at where prices have gone while those tariffs have been in place, they're down. In fact, or at least I say inflation is down more than 60% from its peak. So remember, inflation peaked in mid-June, over 9%. It was 3.3% this morning, year over year. So we've clearly had a great deal of deflation with those tariffs in place. So I'd want to be mindful of the actual trends therein. I think the answer to your question really goes back to what I was talking about a few minutes ago. When it came to updating the 301 tariffs, we looked very carefully at areas where we had significant investments and wanted to make sure that those investments were going to be protected against unfair trade. Well, a lot of that trade remains unfair in other areas as well. And so those tariffs have been in place in order to help, I think, balance out some of those dynamics that have been in place now for a while. I think the important point to recognize is while they've been in place, we've had strong GDP growth, certainly avoided a recession that many people said was almost inevitable. We've had unemployment below 4% for over 2.5 years. So I don't think there's much of a case to be made that those tariffs have hurt in the way that your question may have suggested. I think more, what's been more, I think, compelling to us is making sure that that system of 301 tariffs was extended in a targeted manner in the way I've talked about so far this afternoon.
Thanks, Mr. Bernstein, for that. Gene, we had a question come in for you. This comes from Jeff Berman. Jeff asks, peak season seems to have arrived early this year for a few different reasons. How do you see peak season activity at this point compared to the last couple of years?
Thanks for joining again this month, Jeff. Good to hear from you. We haven't had a traditional peak season, meaning starting bringing in those holiday goods in August, September, October, and kind of leading off into November. In a long time, this has changed quite a bit. I think you've got some seasonality issues right now, but also you've seen strength of market. To get over that 700,000 TEU mark, that psychological mark of 700K in a month, used to be something we strived for. We've been running the gamut on that so far all year long. I think what we see right now in the purchase orders, the ship volume, et cetera, as I mentioned, we'll see mid to high 700s for the month of June. Then we'll probably start to get close to and pierce the 800,000 TEU number as we get into the latter part of the summer and leading into Q4. So I like our chances right now. Again, the underlying economic numbers say the consumer will still keep buying. Manufacturing in tough times and good continues to move forward. There's no real drop off or cliff that we're seeing imminently there either, and looking into the detailed numbers. So this peak season, again, the Port of Los Angeles right now is operating at about 75% of capacity, historical capacity. Taking what we learned from the COVID surge, what we've deployed now, our workforce is really running the numbers well. I was mentioning to Jared before we went on the air that our numbers are at or better than where they were before COVID when it comes to dwell times, how long ships take to work. We're under 4 days now on the average ship that comes into the Port of LA, and we're still exchanging more cargo, loading and unloading, than any other port in the world. We're building 3-mile trains, both the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, for these train departures and collecting those when they arrive. No other port in the world can do that either. So I like where we stand from an efficiency perspective. The workforce is doing a great job. Our numbers, the vital stats of the port look extremely strong, and the volume is coming in all year long. Downline projections equally as good. Thanks.
Gene, we have one last question, and maybe you first, and then Mr. Bernstein can answer this one. This comes from Lisa Bartline from Reuters. Lisa asks, there's a lot of speculation that shippers are rushing to get goods out of China before new tariffs on goods like electric vehicles and computer chips hit. Are either of you seeing anything to support that?
Hi, Lisa. Good to hear from you. I have seen a number of trends with respect to China, and having worked and lived there, I've got a little bit perspective, especially with the folks I continue to keep in contact with on the business side. I've mentioned it before in this setting that when we closed out calendar year 2022, 57% of the Port of Los Angeles business portfolio was made up of China. Last year, we closed out at 53%, and thus far, after the first 5 months, we're in the mid-40s. So we have seen that real shift of manufacturing and sourcing to Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Mexico has now become the #1 trading partner with the United States. So these are real changes to the supply chain. As Jared mentioned earlier, with this most recent round of tariffs on about 4% of goods emanating from China, we may see some of this cargo come in, but it is not going to be a deluge, nor are we going to see a huge drop off after those milestone dates. We watch this very closely every day, but I honestly don't see anything that will impact the trajectory that we're on right now. Jared?
Well, you've really hit all the right points, Gene. I think the only thing I would add is that if you just look at the overall statistics on this, we recently hit one of our lowest manufacturing trade deficits in goods with China on record as a share of the economy, and that's been useful to see. And as I mentioned, and Gene referenced, yet trade flows remain pretty robust. So how does that happen? Well, pretty simple arithmetic. If you're trading less with China, you're trading more, and your trade flows remain about where they were. You're trading more with other countries. And so we've seen reallocation to Vietnam, to Mexico, to some of the other Southeast Asian countries Gene just took you through. And again, underscoring his point, if you actually go down the list of the goods that got the that were designated for the higher tariffs, there were only one or two that actually reached the billions as opposed to the millions. So EVs, I mentioned, EV imports from China, which the tariff went from 25 to 100%. So you might think that was right in the in the middle of the plate for your question. 385 million imports, less than 2,000 cars in 2023. Chinese EV. We just don't import those vehicles. Now, if you go to Europe, by the way, you're going to see much more penetration of Chinese EVs, but not so much here. And most of the other categories were the same in terms of very small shares, and that's why we get to that 4% number. I think one category that was larger than that was grid-sized batteries, and that was more in the 10 billion range in terms of our imports from China in 23. And that tariff doesn't go into place for a couple of years, so there's a little bit of time there for American producers to adjust.
Thank you both so much for those insightful answers. We are going to conclude our media questions for the day, and I'll toss it back to you, Gene, for final thoughts.
Jared, what a privilege. We covered so much today. And as a guy and representing an organization that watches this economy so much, it's just really great to spend time with you and get your insights. Appreciate you taking that time on such a busy day to visit with us today.
My pleasure. Always, it's always great to learn from you, Gene. So thanks for inviting me.
Wonderful. In conclusion, just one more thing from my side. June is my 10th anniversary at the Port of Los Angeles. A decade ago, I was a wide-eyed private sector guy coming into a new role of government work. When you walk into any new job, everything you see looks like a challenge. And the worst thing anybody could do at that moment is think they have all the answers. So I made a conscious effort to visit with as many people as possible, learn as much as I could, and believe me, I'm still learning today. That's because every challenge offers an opportunity for learning. And for every breakthrough, an accomplishment comes out, and a new door opens to an even better set of relationships. On the environmental front, many challenges lie ahead, but we've made great progress over the last decade with our public and private sector partners. Emissions are down at the Port of Los Angeles ahead of projections, and we take pride in being the only port complex in the world, along with Long Beach, with an ambitious, active path toward becoming a zero-emission operation. Over the last 10 years, we've worked with Longshore Labor, our terminal partners, and others to move more than 92.5 million container units across our docks. For 24 consecutive years, Los Angeles has been the Western Hemisphere's busiest container port. And that's significant because what we do extends far beyond Southern California. It impacts jobs and economies of every single congressional district in the United States. Even at the height of COVID, we remained resilient. We met the challenges, learned from them, and we built back stronger. On the digital front, We've made dramatic advances, leveraging data to optimize efficiency. Our innovative Port Optimizer platform provides stakeholders with greater visibility and planning capabilities while ensuring the highest level of security. Our internal cybersecurity operations center, which will celebrate 10 years in September, has positioned us as a global leader in data protection. And our external cyber resilience center provides a collaborative platform for our industry partners to collectively defend against the ever-evolving cyber threatscape. Speaking of collective efforts, the strength of any organization goes beyond its physical assets. Our port is not the sum of its docks, cranes, and trucks. It's the sum of our people. The women and men of the Port of Los Angeles don't just work there, we live there. Providing good jobs, clean air, and a thriving waterfront is so important to all of us. Over the past decade, the port has undergone a remarkable transformation, turning the Wilmington and San Pedro waterfronts into vibrant destinations. The new $77 million Wilmington Waterfront Promenade, Altasea's $35 million transformation into a blue economy development center, and next year, West Harbor will redefine the LA waterfront with dining, entertainment, and shopping. A thriving cruise business has brought back tourism, jobs, and revenue into our local communities. In short, the Port of Los Angeles is busier, cleaner, safer, and more enjoyable to visit than it was a decade ago. What'll happen in the next 10 years? New challenges will drive more accomplishments and forge even deeper relationships. Whatever the coming years bring, our North Star remains the same: community, environment, jobs, and cargo. Educator Peter Drucker once said, "The best way to predict the future is to create it." That's what we're doing here at the Port of Los Angeles. We're shaping a more sustainable future with zero-emission trucks, cranes, a green shipping corridor between Asia, Los Angeles, and Long Beach. We're developing a more efficient future by using secure data to move cargo through our port faster than ever before. We're building a more promising future for tomorrow's workforce through signature initiatives, whether it's youth programs through Pola Works or the nation's first goods movement training campus located right in Wilmington. And we're contributing to the region's economic future as we invest billions of dollars in a wide range of projects to make our harbor enclave a great place to live, work, and visit. But out of all that, you know what excites me the most as I look ahead? That there are so many great minds converging from so many directions. We're going to see groundbreaking thinking that will revolutionize the maritime industry on a global scale. And what, ladies and gentlemen, could be more thrilling than that? Thank you all so much for joining again, and we'll see you once more in July.